the very first recording of Mass unearthed by musicologists in the early 1980s, now on a new compact disc on the archive label from the 14-voice ensemble Planarium, conducted by Alexander Nutschlick. 447772 and 2. Catalog number of this archive recording events for St. Quentin. Performance today.
This is Tom Drysdale conducting an interview for the American Overseas Schools Archives. We are interviewing Betty Lou St. George, and we are in the temporary location of the American Overseas Schools Archives at 13292 West Holly Street in Goodyear, Arizona. The date is March the 11th, 1996, and we have the very good fortune of having Betty Lou here with us as a house guest for a few days, and we want to talk to her about her overseas experiences and her life with her family overseas. Good evening, Betty.
Good evening, Tom.
Yeah. Are you enjoying your visit?
Absolutely. This has been wonderful.
Well, good. We want to start, Betty, with finding out where you were born.
I was born in San Pedro, California.
In San Pedro. Speak up just a little bit now.
Okay.
In San Pedro,
California.
Uh-huh. Born in San Pedro. Where did you go to elementary school?
I went to Miralesta Elementary School. And
Was that in San Pedro?
No, it was in Palos Verdes.
In Palos Verdes, which is near San Pedro, right?
Yes. And then from 6th grade through 9th grade, I went to Mary Star of the Sea.
Mary Star of the Sea?
Which was a Catholic parochial school.
I see.
And the first half of the 10th grade, I went to St. Anthony's High School in Long Beach. And after that, I went to San Pedro High School, where I graduated in 1943.
All right. Now, the elementary school, was that in San Pedro?
No, it was in Palos Verdes.
In Palos Verdes. Okay, then the next one that you mentioned, where was that?
In San Pedro.
That was in San Pedro. And the name of that school again?
Mary Star of the Sea.
Mary Star
of the Sea.
Of the Sea. And that was a Catholic parochial school.
Yes.
Is it still in existence?
Yes, it is.
It's still, tell us a little bit about the curriculum. Was it kind of a classical preparatory
Very
school?
definitely classical, strictly the 3 R's, and a wonderful foundation.
Well, yes.
We were non-Catholics in the school, our family, the 3 of us attended.
Oh, I see. You were not a part of the Catholic
faith,
no. But so I see. So they let other than Catholics attend.
Yes.
Oh,
the tuition we paid allowed several of the Catholic children who could not afford going to school attend.
Oh, I see. So that covered them. Yeah. All right. So now that was up through what grade?
Through 9th grade.
Through 9th.
6th through 9th.
All right. And then you went to high school.
I went to high school in Long Beach. We rode the red car from San Pedro to Long Beach, the old PE red
right,
car.
Right.
To Long Beach.
Now, was this the public school?
No, it was St. Anthony's, was a Catholic high school.
St. Anthony's, I see, in Long Beach.
In Long Beach.
Oh,
and the reason I only attended for a half a year, they decided that the non-Catholics had to leave because they really didn't have enough room for their own Catholic students. And they divided the school into a girls' and boys' school, and the Jesuits came in to teach the boys.
I see.
So we returned to the public school system in San Pedro High.
And you went to the public school?
Through the last half of the 10th through 12th grade.
I see. When you say we...
well, my sister and I.
I see.
Eventually my younger brother.
Yeah, I see. All right. Well, you had this Catholic school preparation, which was pretty rigorous, I guess. But it was good preparation, right?
Oh, it was wonderful.
Yeah,
I
excellent.
think the greatest advantage was the English teachers. We had a wonderful foundation in English. And, of course, the Catholic schools taught Latin as
Sure.
part of their curriculum. You had no choice. You took Latin. And it was a wonderful foundation for all of the other languages.
Sure, right. All of the Romance languages that
Yes.
have their basis in
Yes.
Latin, yeah. Well, that was an excellent preparation. What did your father do, or your mother? What was their line of work?
My parents were divorced when I was 5, and my mother was a great philanthropist. She was very active in many charities. As a matter of fact, she was the director of the Red Cross. In those days, they were volunteers up until the war. And then the Red Cross decided that they needed a man to head it because of the war. But she also was active in the Assistance League and developed, which I think was one of the most wonderful ideas, the Assistance League she wanted to have a dental clinic for underprivileged children. And she was trying to figure out where she could raise money. She went to Hollywood Park, which is a racetrack, and she sold the board of directors on racing one day for charity, that the proceeds would go to charity, and just for children. And they hired her to find all of the charities in Southern California that did work just with children. And I think the first year was 1938, and the budget she had to work with was something like, if I can remember correctly, about $38,000.
Which was a lot of money in those days.
Yes, and some charities only received $10 and $15, but this bought either baseball bats and all. So she had always been interested in charity work and this type of thing. She was very, very active.
Well, what a wonderful lady. Now, are you saying that when the family broke up, that you went with your mother?
We all stayed with my mother.
You all stayed with your mother. I see. Well, she's a wonderful lady, evidently.
Yes, she was. She was
Is she
very
still alive by
dynamic
chance?
and brilliant. No, she lived to be 92, and she died a few years ago.
I see. All right. So now this brings us up through high school. After high school, did you go to work, or did you go right to college then, or what happened?
I graduated on a Friday night, and Monday morning I started at the University of Southern California.
All right. As a freshman.
As a freshman.
A liberal arts.
It was in 1943, and no, I was a pre-med student.
Pre-med.
It was in 1943. It was during the year, during the war, and the universities were running 3 semesters a year. So that, and I was very young in those days.
Sure, yeah.
But I could have finished my 4 years of college in 2 years and 8 months.
An accelerated program, was it?
It was an
because of
accelerated
the war?
program because of the war.
Yeah, right.
All of the universities were
Yes.
going because of the B-12
Right.
and the Naval ROTC and the professional schools had both A-12 and B-12.
Yeah. And USC at the time had a very active ROTC.
They had an active
bet.
ROTC. The
bet.
medical and dental school had the equivalent of the ROTC, but it was the Navy, Army.
Right. Well,
And we
so-
had Marines at SC
Sure.
too.
Well, so you started as a pre-med,
Yes.
and then what changed you from medicine to, I'm assuming,
I
education?
changed into education because for girls to get into med school in those days, back in '44, was rather difficult, and I wanted to go to USC's med school. So my mother said while I was waiting, why didn't I take some education courses?
Mm-hmm.
And I did, and I graduated, and I started teaching, and I loved it.
I see. Well, you graduated in what year now?
I graduated in June of 47.
In 47 with a bachelor's degree.
And
then,
Bachelor of Science.
And then you started teaching?
I started teaching for Los Angeles City.
Whereabouts?
I taught in the harbor area in San Pedro at 7th Street.
Going home almost.
Absolutely. It was just down the hill from the house.
Uh-huh. And so you taught there. What grade level?
I taught first grade.
First grade.
And the first year I had 47 students in an auditorium because they
40.
didn't have enough classrooms.
47 students. My goodness.
They learned in spite of.
Now, what's the name of the school?
7th Street School.
7th Street Public
Yes.
Public School. And they didn't have enough room, so they had you teach in an auditorium.
Right.
What brought that about? They had an increase in enrollment, or
Well, this was really the first big crop of war babies
that early?
in 47. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see.
And then as the enrollment increased, we brought in temporary buildings and bungalows and that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
like they did, especially in California, which
Yes.
had all of the GIs returning who had been there before and
Right.
fell in love with California, and yeah, all that sort of thing. All right, yeah, Betty Lou. Now, how long did you stay in that school?
I was there for 3 years.
With first grade all the time?
Taught first grade all of the time, and was a volunteer assistant principal. The school wasn't large enough to have an assistant principal. We didn't have enough students. So I think the title was teacher in charge.
Yes, I see.
At that time,
I see.
if the principal had to be away from the school, then I was in charge. So I had a lovely classroom right across from the office.
I see. And I assume that school still exists to this day, probably, or?
Well, no, the
Doesn't it?
school has been torn down and they have built a new building. 7th Street is still there, but it's a very modern new school building.
The 7th Street School is still there.
7th Street
But
School
another
is
one.
still there,
I know.
but the building that was there when I taught there has been torn down.
It's gone. I see. All right. Now, you were 3 years there.
I was there 3 years.
First grade each year.
Yes.
I see. Then where did you go?
Well, my principal tacked up a notice on the bulletin board one day, and it was a bulletin sent around to the schools in Los Angeles looking for teachers to go overseas to teach. And Mrs. Bragg said, "Betty, did you see the bulletin?" And I said, "Yes." And at that time, they were requiring 5 years experience. You had to be 25 years of age.
Now, what year would this be?
This was in
47, you say, huh? 48?
1950.
That, all right.
And I had been teaching 3 years.
Uh-huh.
And she said, I said, "Well, I don't qualify. I saw it, but I don't qualify." And she said, "It's good experience, and I think you should do this."
A good experience to interview? Is that
To
it?
interview for the overseas, because she said you might want to do this in future years, and having the experience of the interview, you will see what they would like to have. Well, I thought, why should I go up there and have them reject me? So I wasn't too enthusiastic. Well, she called my mother, and between the two of them, they convinced me I should fill out the forms and go to Los Angeles for the interview for overseas schools.
I see. Now, what was the principal's name? You mentioned
Vina Bragg.
Bragg?
Bragg.
B-R-A-G?
G-G.
G-G.
Yes, and she just passed away last year.
Oh, my
But
goodness.
she's been a friend for life.
Well, that's very interesting, too. She must have been up in her 90s also, or something
Yes.
like that. Yes, well, good. We've got her on tape now a little bit. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so you went down and you were interviewed, and then what happened?
I was interviewed, and one of the interesting things was I was interviewed by Mr. Fry, who convinced me that I might like to go to Japan.
Is this Harry Fry?
Yes, from Yokohama.
Uh-huh.
And he said I would hear by the 1st of May.
So Harry was saying, okay, you don't have the 5 years, but we're still interested in you. Was that what came out of the interview?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, I see.
And so he said, be sure to send all of your papers in. And I don't remember the man in Washington who was the contact.
Probably.
But his first name was Ron.
Oh, that would be Ron Downing.
Very possibly.
That'd be Ron Downing, right? At that time, right. Mm-hmm.
So I made sure I had sent in all my papers. We had to fill out a Form 57, I think, for civil service or
right.
something or other. So every day from the 1st of May, I went to the mailbox when I got home, and no letter.
And no what?
No letter from the Department of the Army.
Mm-hmm.
Every day I went, and nothing. On the, maybe 10th or 11th of June, one night we were sitting at the dinner table and the phone rang, and it was Western Union. And the man at Western Union said, I have a telegram for you from the Department of Defense. And this was asking me whether I would accept. They were waiting for my answer, that they were holding the position open, but if I didn't want to go, and since they had not heard from me. And San Pedro was a small town, and the fellow says, oh, I remember we got a telegram several weeks ago. Didn't you ever get that?
Gee.
So I very definitely said I would go, and I sent a telegram back to Washington that night, accepting the position in Japan, but I didn't know where it was.
Didn't know where in Japan.
But I was so excited. You cannot believe.
I can imagine. Sure.
It was wonderful.
All right, and that would have been roughly in the
50.
school year. That was in June.
June of 50.
June, as late as June,
just
so right at the
before
end of
the
the year.
Korean War.
All right, so you accepted and filled out all the paperwork, and then tell us about getting ready to leave and how you left and how you got to Japan.
Well, about the middle of July, we got a call from Washington telling us that we didn't have to go because of the Korean War if we didn't want to. And we were given a choice that we didn't have to sign a contract. But I don't know anybody who turned it down. It seems like we all went. We went to Norton Air Force Base for our physicals.
When you say we, were there quite a few?
There were several from Southern California that went. There was a group of about 20.
About 20,
that I knew of. And we got a notification for our physicals at Norton Air Force Base. And then we were sent word, we were to go to the Union Station to get our travel vouchers for the train, and 20 of us went up on the night train to San Francisco together to meet at Fort Mason to process.
At Fort again?
At Fort Mason in
Fort
San Francisco.
Mason.
And we stayed up all night on the train and talked and
I'll bet you did.
Shared experiences. We were all so excited. You can't believe.
Sure.
This was so unusual in those days.
Wonderful experience.
It was.
Sure.
And when we got to Fort Mason, the first 2 ships with refugee Army dependent families were coming in from Korea. And they had run out of water on one ship 2 days out. And the Army just looked at us and said, we're sorry, we have 2 ships that we have to take care of. And we're too busy to process you other than to give you your shots and everything. And they made reservations for all of us on the President lines. We went on the President Cleveland to Japan, that instead of going on an Army transport.
On the troop ship.
So we had 3 extra days in San Francisco. which all of the gals spent shopping because we hadn't brought cocktail dresses to wear on the troop ship.
Sure.
So we shopped and enhanced our wardrobe so that we would enjoy our first class cruise on the
Well,
Cleveland.
wasn't that a wonderful
It was
event?
exciting.
Yeah.
22 days out to Yokohama.
22 days. Well, that was a coincidence that worked in
Oh.
your favor, didn't
It was so
Oh.
exciting. To go on an elegant cruise at that age was...
it? At 22, at 22.
I was 23.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And-
And 22 days in.
And it
in-
took 22 days because we stopped in Honolulu.
How long did you stop there?
We arrived at 8 in the morning and sailed at about 9 o'clock at night. And it was marvelous. You could almost smell the island before you got there, the fragrance of the
Oh,
flowers. And there were only 3 hotels on Waikiki Beach
At that time, yeah.
in those days.
Did you get off the ship at all?
Oh, yes.
So
I
you got
had
in.
friends, the commander of the Coast Guard district in Honolulu's daughter and I had gone to school together, and so they met me, and I spent the day with them, seeing the
wonderful,
island. And
wonderful. They showed you around a little bit.
absolutely.
Oh,
it was
that was
marvelous.
wonderful. All right, Betty, let's back up now, back to San Francisco. You get on the ship. Anything unusual happen when you were leaving San Francisco, or?
Absolutely. My parents went to San Francisco to
Your
see us
parent-
all
Your
off.
parents?
My parents.
All right, now.
My stepfather and
Okay,
my
so there's
mother.
another. Okay, so you got a
Yes.
stepfather. Now you're all right.
Yes.
All right.
And we stayed with the Macmillans. Colonel Macmillan had been the commander of Letterman Hospital and had been friends of my parents for years. So we stayed with them, but all of our group got to know my parents as we went shopping, and we did so many things together. So my mother said, I'm going to wave to you as you go out under the Golden Gate Bridge. And as we sailed about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and there was my mother standing on the Golden Gate Bridge, waving a sheet.
Waving a sheet?
A sheet. All of us had gotten pillowcases from our staterooms, and we were on the deck waving our pillowcases.
Waving back at your mother.
And my mother.
Yeah.
And what my father had done was he had stopped on the bridge. She got out, crawled over the railing,
Uh-huh.
and was on the walkway waving. He went all the way across the bridge, turned around, and came back. She went across the traffic and hopped into the car when he came back. Now, you know, you're not supposed to do that.
Of course.
But in those days, there wasn't that much traffic on the Golden Gate
Uh-huh.
Bridge.
Well, wasn't that a wonderful?
So-
and so your friends,
All my
other people,
friends.
they were involved too.
Oh, absolutely.
And
We
waving
were
back with the pillowcases.
with the pillowcases from the deck on the Cleveland.
Yeah, of course, with the height of that bridge, you know, just if your mother was up there by herself waving to you, you couldn't have probably told who it was. But here, waving that sheet,
It was huge.
that was quite an experience.
It was really exciting, and I think my mother was as excited about my going to Japan as I was. She thought it was such a wonderful opportunity.
Well, as you've described her and how much she was involved with, you know, the community and with
Yes.
her philanthropic activities and all that sort of thing, I can imagine that she was very thrilled for, you know, what was going to happen to you. Okay.
I think she thought that she sort of vicariously lived the experience
I'll bet.
through me.
Yeah, I'll bet. Uh-huh. Well, that is wonderful. And your stepfather, he was very supportive too.
Oh,
is that
yes,
right?
yes.
I see. All right, so you got over to Honolulu and met friends there and spent the day there, and then got back on board. And did you make any other stops between there and Japan?
I love the question. Just to show you how young and naive I was, they told us on the ship that we all ought to get our postcards written because we were going to pass the mail buoy. Well, I was prepared for the mail buoy, and it never appeared. And everyone got a good laugh out of that. But we did pass the President Wilson.
Well, now wait a minute. Now, what was the mail buoy? Let's see.
It was a joke.
And that was supposed to
But
be a.
now, where would a mail buoy be out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean?
Well, what is a mail buoy in the first place? What are we
Well, it
talking
would
about?
be like a post office on the way to Japan, because it was 6,000 miles from San Francisco.
Right.
And so this would be our opportunity to mail postcards home.
Yeah.
And I believed them. I was very gullible.
Right. Okay. But you didn't stop off at a place like Midway
No,
or
no, no.
Guam.
We
or
went
any other
right
place. You went
into
directly into
Yokohama.
Yokohama.
We did have a typhoon on the way, which slowed us down for about 3 days. We slowed
Was it
down.
pretty rough? Pretty rough
Wallowed
weather?
around at about 2 knots an hour for about 3 days.
Yeah.
Very few people appeared in the dining room during that time.
I'll bet. Did it frighten you at all?
No,
But,
I was young enough to think this was really exciting.
Sure. Okay, you went into Yokohama. Were you met by anybody there at the
Oh,
boat?
the most exciting thing, here comes the Army band was there, playing wonderful tunes. You just felt you had arrived, and they welcomed us. We really thought we were very special.
Well, you were, sure. Going to teach their children, sure.
But it really was special. And Margaret Lynch came on board and gave everybody their assignments.
All right, now
Those
who was
of us-
Margaret Lynch?
She was our principal at Narragansett Elementary School.
At Narragansett Elementary School. Okay,
Yes.
and where is Narragansett located?
It is in Grant Heights, which was a housing area, about a half an hour out of downtown Tokyo by bus.
Uh-huh.
And we drew children from Camp Drake and from the Grant Heights area.
Right.
Also a few from Camp Drew.
Yeah, you see, people will be looking at this videotape many years in the future, and they may not have, or they perhaps will never have heard of Narragansett. You see, and that sort of thing. And
Well-
so we just get it located in place here. you
Now,
see.
Camp Drake was the replacement depot going to Korea.
Mm-hmm.
The troops that came in on the ship went directly to Camp Drake, and from Camp Drake they were processed to onto Korea.
All right, so you were met by the principal, and what did you do, get on buses or?
Yes, we got on Army buses, and my first impressions as we drove, we could see the devastation of the war between Yokohama and Tokyo. But the trees were small, the people were small, the houses were small. I mean, all of a sudden, I realized we were in Japan. It was a totally different scene.
Everything was small.
Yes, it did not look like California.
Sure. All right, so in the buses, did they take you over to where your quarters were? or-
Yes, they took us to the old Kaijo Hotel.
And how would you spell that?
It's
Do you remember?
OLD, capital K-A-I-J-O.
A Japanese hotel which was run by
The American military.
American
It was Department of the Army hotel. I
Right,
guess.
mm-hmm, right, okay.
And there were hundreds of women that lived there. I believe it was 7 stories.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the buildings in Tokyo were not more than 7 stories because no one could look down on the emperor.
Isn't that interesting? No one could look down on the emperor, and that's the reason they didn't build to any great heights in those
That's
days.
right. In
Yeah.
those days.
Right.
And when you see the skyscrapers today in Tokyo, that obviously things have changed.
Quite different, right. Okay, so they got you billeted into your quarters.
Yes.
Was that a temporary billet, or
No,
was it
these
a
were our
permanent?
permanent quarters.
All right. Okay, and now, how long were you there before you reported to the school to start teaching?
the next day.
Oh, that's
we
soon.
went out to
You
school.
went to the school, and
And the first thing that Margaret gave all of us was a mimeograph list of initials that we had to learn, like GHQ and
right.
APO and all of the initials.
I see. All right. So we call them acronyms, don't we? Yeah, for
Yes.
standing for
Yes.
different things.
But there were pages of it
Oh, pages, I'm sure.
that we
sure
had to
remember.
memorize so that
Yeah.
we would be familiar with all the terminology in
the military was
bulletins
using.
that we got from the
Right,
military.
right.
Right.
All right, so you started right there the next day, and then how soon did the children arrive after that?
2 weeks.
In 2 weeks. So you had a couple of weeks to get ready
We
for
had
them.
2 weeks to
and that
get
sort of
ready
thing.
for
So
school.
you were going back and forth to the hotel every day, and
By
you
bus.
probably did some exploration in Tokyo, a few nights out to this and that, and getting acquainted, or not?
Well, the very first night I was there, I met my husband, to be.
You met your husband the first night?
To be.
You first, yeah, that's what I mean.
Yes.
How did that
It was a
happen?
blind date. One of the WACs on the ship reported into her office, and one of the men in the office asked her if she would like to go out to GHQ for dinner and dancing that night, and she accepted. And he said, by the way, do you have a friend? I have a roommate. And the roommate turned out to be Bill, and we were,
Your future husband.
My
Now, what
future
was
husband.
he doing there at the time?
he had the, he was in the Signal Corps, and he was with the 71st Battalion, but he had a separate company. He was in the battalion area.
So he was an officer in the Signal Corps at that time,
Yes.
right? Uh-huh.
And we used to call him the Tokyo Telephone Man.
I see. What rank was he at that time?
When I met him, he was
Uh-huh.
a first lieutenant.
First lieutenant. Not much older or older at all than you, probably. Not much,
10 years.
was he?
Yeah.
I see. First lieutenant in the Signal Corps. Now, that's your future husband.
Yes.
My good. And, well, how long did it take for that to evolve into a courtship?
Oh, quite a while.
So you
Um,
you started teaching.
that I started teaching, and we'd go out and go to the movies, have dinner, but he was really very busy until after the landing at Incheon.
We're talking about the Korean.
During the Korean
Korean
War,
War,
until
right.
after the landing at Incheon.
Yeah.
I'd get a telephone call for a few minutes, and when he had a pre-night, he would like to go out. But it wasn't until after the landing at
The
Incheon
invasion there, yeah.
that
Uh-huh.
he had some free time
Free
in
time.
the evenings.
Yeah, sure. Did you date anybody else at that time, or was he?
Well, of course.
Of course. Huh? So you hadn't already decided that he was it, huh?
Well, I had decided that he was it, but he wasn't available all the time. And when you're young, and it was exciting, my heavens, there were at least 300 men to every woman that was there. And,
That wasn't so bad, was it?
well, no.
That wasn't so bad. Right.
I don't think I'd ever had that proportion before in my life.
Right. Okay. Now I'm going to sidetrack just a little bit from the school because we got this thing going with Bill, your future husband. It took a while because of the Korean War before he had time enough for you to really get serious dating and all that sort of thing. When did you get married?
We were married at my parents' ranch in Valley Center, California on September 11th, 1953. I came home and taught a year before.
Oh, I see. So you'd had your overseas experiences teaching out of the way and came back to California and taught a year before he arrived and you got married there. Okay, well, that's important. We get that in place. Okay.
I was very practical. I didn't know whether under those circumstances this was the reality world or not.
Sure.
So I came home and taught a year to make sure that
Make sure it was the right
I
decision.
was making the right decision.
I see. Okay. All right. Now going back to when he started courting, you know, that sort of thing. Well, now you were teaching. What grade level in
I
Japan?
taught first grade.
First grade, the same as back in California.
The first year I taught first grade. The second year I taught second grade.
Oh, I see. And
we had too many second graders, and Margaret asked for volunteers, and nobody volunteered. And I've been a volunteer all my life, and I couldn't say no. So I ended up with the second grade.
In the following year?
The second year.
Now, at that time, you were still going with Bill.
Oh, yes.
Oh,
yes.
I see. And now you were at Narramos for 2 years, right?
Right.
And then you returned home. What made you decide to return home instead of staying overseas forever?
Well,
so
in
to
those
speak?
days, you just had a 1-year contract. And we went for 1 year, and I'd had such a good time, and I thought a second year would be nice. So I wrote a letter asking for an extension of another year on my leave of absence. Now, LA only allowed you a 2-year leave of absence, and at the end of that you had to resign, or else you had to come home.
Oh, so you left on a leave of absence from L.A.
Uh-huh.
I see. So you had that contract with them before you left.
So they gave me 1 year, and they extended it a second year.
I
But
see.
at the end of that time, you either resigned or came back.
Came back. So there was a reason why you came back
Yes.
then. Sure. Yeah, I see. That's understandable. So you came back.
This
Did you
was
go?
before the Army decided they were really going to stay in the school business.
Sure. They didn't know that much about it. You know, it was still an experimental situation. Sure. Okay. So you came back. Now, did you go to the same school you left?
Yes. Yes.
And did you go back to the first grade?
I started the year with the first grade, but then they needed a second grade teacher because of our tremendous increase of second grade students.
Well, no.
We had 8 first grades.
No,
and
are we
7
talking about
second grades.
Japan, or are we talking about?
Japan.
Yeah. Okay. Now, what I mean,
Oh.
my question is, when you came back to California,
I taught third grade.
well, you taught third grade, so you had first to begin with, you know. Then you went over there first, and then second.
Second.
Then you came back to the same school, and then you taught third grade
Third
there.
grade.
Oh, I see.
And it's wonderful to go up because you just can't believe how smart the children are.
Well, they learn a lot, don't they? That period of time, right?
And I taught the mentally gifted children when I came back.
So you had a
In
lot that
third
were
grade.
beyond third grade level, then, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Now, how long did you teach at that school?
I taught just 1 year, and then I got married.
Then you got married to Bill. All right, so you came home, and you kept, it's obvious that you kept in touch with Bill. And where along that line did you get engaged?
Oh, before we left Japan.
Before you left Japan. So, oh, I see. And then you came back and taught a year.
Right.
Then he came back and met your folks.
Right.
Did you get to meet his folks before you got married?
No.
Didn't
But
get to do
he
that.
had met my folks. He spent a week with us in Palos Verdes, and everyone told Bill that all you had to do was look out and you could see Catalina Island. And we had fog the whole month. He was there.
And he couldn't
And
see it.
the very last day, the tip of Catalina Island came out of the fog. So he finally believed me that it really was there. It was unusual. And everybody told him it was unusual weather, which is a typical California statement.
All right, Betty Lou, we're going to pick this up. I'm going to have a little break, or we're going to have a little break, and then we'll pick it up a few minutes later. All right?
All right.
This is the American Overseas Schools Archives, continuing the interview of Betty Lou St. George. We stopped for a few minutes and had a break. All right, Betty Lou, we were, let's see, where were we? Where did we drop off? You'd gotten married. You'd come back from Japan.
I'd come back from
and
Japan
you
and taught
taught
a year.
third grade,
Yes.
right?
And then I was married after teaching
Oh,
a
after
year.
a full year. Well, where
Yes.
was Bill during that year you were teaching third grade back in California?
He was in Indianapolis at Fort Benjamin Harrison at Advanced Finance School.
Did you see him during the year?
Easter vacation.
Easter vacation, that sort of thing.
And he came out for Christmas.
Oh, I see. And then where did you get married?
We got married at my folks' ranch in Valley Center, California.
Where's Valley Center?
It's in San Diego County. Well, they really opened the road into Valley Center when they took the big lens up to Mount Palomar for the observatory. And they cut the road through from Escondido. And
So is it between San Diego and Mount Palomar?
mm-hmm.
That's where,
Mm-hmm.
I see.
Near
They
Lake
have a ranch.
Wolford.
They had a ranch
They
there.
had a ranch
What kind of a
down there.
ranch?
I think the main thing they grew were weeds.
So it was, it wasn't
No, it wasn't a
livestock,
working ranch.
cattle or...
It was a typical California ranch.
I see. A lot of acreage.
Right.
I see. But they weren't raising cattle
No.
or anything like that.
It was
you see.
covered. It was a beautiful mountain and meadow with
I see.
oak trees.
Mhm,
And
yeah.
just a beautiful
Lovely,
spot.
lovely place. Yeah. Do you still have it? Does the family still have
No.
it?
No, it's been sold.
Been sold. Okay, so that's where you were married. That must have been nice to go there to the ranch. And did you have any of your old friends that you went to Japan with at the wedding?
Yes, Dottie East, and who had taught second grade the first year I was there, and Gladys Benson, who went over with us on the President Cleveland, and also became an assistant principal the second year that we were in Japan. And Gladys taught, I think, second grade the first year, and then she was one of the two assistant principals at
I see.
Naramas.
So they were at your wedding.
They were at my
Were
wedding.
they still working for the dependent schools overseas?
Not at that time.
Or they had come back
They had
also?
come back to the San Diego district.
I see. I see. All right. So, all right. Then you got married. What month and year was this?
We were married September 11th, 1953.
1953, and
Bill
then,
was assigned at the Pentagon, and so our honeymoon was driving across country to our new home in Arlington, Virginia.
I see. And the Pentagon wasn't all that old at that time. As I recall, it was finished about 1948. So it was a pretty new building. So he had an assignment in the Pentagon, and you lived in
in the
Arlington.
office of the chief signal officer.
I see. Did you buy property there, or
Yes,
did you
we
rent?
bought
So
a
you
house.
bought a house. And how long were you there?
4 years.
4 years. And did you teach school?
No, I
see.
started my family.
Started your family. All right. Well,
Jenny was born in 54 at Fort Belvoir in Virginia.
Now you say Jenny. That is
Virginia Lee, St. George.
Virginia Lee, St. George.
Yes.
And-
My maiden name was Magellan. Which-
Magellan. Let's spell that.
It's M-J-E-L-L-E-M.
Which is Scandinavian.
Scandinavian, and at Naramas, the first year I was known as 1MJ, and the second year I was known as 2MJ.
2MJ. I can see why.
The
Mhm.
designation for first or second grade.
Right. Okay. All right. Now, and you call Virginia
We named,
Jenny.
we called Jenny.
Jenny.
But we decided on the name Virginia Lee, and when we received her birth certificate, we found that she was born in the state of Virginia in the magistrate of Lee. And I've often wondered if people thought we had much imagination with that duplication.
Right.
The first line was Virginia Lee, and the second line was Virginia Lee.
Isn't that interesting? Right. And you, I guess you still have that birth certificate, or
Oh,
she does,
absolutely.
right? That's something, right? All right. Now she was born again. What date is this now? We're
June 11th, 1954.
1954, and then you had another child later on.
Yes, Martin was born when we were in Paris.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll get to Paris. All right. So Virginia Lee was born in 54. Backing up, you arrived there in 53, but you stayed there for 4 years.
Yes.
With Bill in the Pentagon, and of course you were taking care of the baby and all that sort of thing. And then his next assignment was Paris. Is that it?
No, his next assignment was to Bad Tolz, Germany.
Bad Tolz. Uh-huh.
And we were, well, we lived in Bad Tolz. He was assigned to the Kaserne at Lengries, which was 7 miles up the river. But our housing was in Bad Tolz.
Uh-huh.
And we were there, from, say, May of 57. Not till maybe 59.
Uh-huh. I see.
Yeah.
At Bad Tolz.
At Bad Tolz.
Now, by this time, he was probably a captain or a major by that time.
He was a captain.
By
He
that
was a
time.
captain when we were at the Pentagon.
Uh-huh.
And he received his majority while we were at Lengries.
I see. And
Then we went from Lengries to, he was, let's see, he went to Lengries to teach finance because he had been, he had prepared the budget for the Signal Corps at the Pentagon. That was his
now you're
job.
saying Lengries?
Lengries. Lenggries.
And now what?
It was a concern that had both the quartermaster school and the signal school.
And that was located at?
About 7 miles south of Bad Tolz.
All right.
So our housing area was in Bad Tolz, and the
I
men
see.
drove out
Yeah,
to
I've
the other
never
concern.
heard of that.
Well, they had the
Lenggries.
Brownick was the mountain right behind Lengries, and it had a ski tow. It was a very popular place for people to come skiing. We were an hour south of Munich.
Oh, okay.
So
All
we
right.
were really between
Beautiful
Munich and
country.
Garmisch
Yeah, beautiful area.
in the
there.
mountains.
Yeah, right. The frost is beautiful in that area
Yes.
in the wintertime. All right. So you were there roughly a couple of years.
2.5 years.
2.5. And then,
We went to Heidelberg. Bill went to be signal comptroller for USERA.
all right.
And while we were there, USERA decided that they were going to have an exchange with the French Army, and they were going to exchange 5 French officers and 5 American officers from different branches of service. So the Signal Corps tossed all the names into the pot, and they came up, they were looking for French officers who had French as a second language. And there were only 2, and one was due to rotate in 2 months, and then there was Bill. So he went for the interview with the French military in Baden-Baden, and apparently was accepted. So we had our choice of going to Zweibrücken or to Freiburg, Germany, and we went down and looked at the quarters in both places, and we chose Freiburg.
Mm-hmm.
So we were with the 3rd French Army Division.
In Freiburg. And so Bill was fluent in French then?
Yes.
Where did he
yes.
pick that up?
He went to school in Massachusetts, and he went to a French parochial school where they taught all the subjects in the morning in French and the same subjects in the afternoon in English. And the only difference was in French they taught Canadian history, and the English part in the afternoon they taught U.S. history.
Well, that was good for him, wasn't it?
Yes.
That was real
Yes.
good. All right, so you were down there then, in Freiburg area,
Mm-hmm.
within that exchange with, and there was a French military officer who replaced him
In Heidelberg.
In Heidelberg, sure.
Yes.
And how long did that exchange last?
That was a year exchange.
Gee, that was a great experience, I'll bet.
And
wasn't
it was. We lived in French Army quarters, and I did not speak a word of French. And the first thing Bill did was hire a Berlitz teacher to come to the house every day for an hour's lesson. And when we did the inventory for the house, I had 60 dinner plates. I didn't have a single bread and butter plate because they put the bread on the table. I had a dozen wine glasses for each kind of wine known to man. There wasn't a water glass in the house. It was just really quite different. And we shopped at the French commissary, and we were issued ration cards. And our daily ration of wine was 2 bottles for Bill, 2 bottles for me, and
Should
2
be.
bottles for Ginny, age 5.
It should be enough, huh? Especially for Ginny.
But everybody got 2 bottles of wine on their ration card, and that was the Vin Ordinaire. You could buy other wines in the commissary, but the Vin Ordinaire,
Which was the common
everyday
right, yeah.
drink.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you really didn't drink it all, the next day you could use it for the vinegar in your salad
salads
dressing.
and things, sure. Mm-hmm. Right, very, very important part of their life.
And it was delicious.
Sure.
It really
sure,
was.
Yeah. Well, that was quite an experience for you. Did you? I'm sure you did. You picked up some of the French then, to where you could get along with the maid or the or in the commissary or whatever. And
I could get along very well. I gave many Frenchmen a good laugh.
Did you?
Because my accent was terrible. But Jenny went to the French Army Dependent Schools. The school was called Vauban, and she had her kindergarten experience there. She had gone to the Heidelberg School. She started in September, but we went with the French in October, so she really didn't have a very long experience
Was that
in the Heidelberg kindergarten.
Was that difficult for her, that transition into the French school?
It was very, very interesting. Of course, we were living in French quarters in Germany because it was the French occupation zone.
Uh-huh.
And all the little children played down in the courtyard with Jenny speaking German. Jenny had gone to a German preschool in Bad Tolz and had learned German. Then when we went to the French sector, the little French children had learned German. And so that was their common language. And they played in German until Jenny learned how to speak French.
Isn't that interesting? And of course, at that age, they pick it up.
They pick it up so
like
quickly.
sponges, you know, and
Yes.
especially when they play together and do that. Well, that was good for her.
One of a fun story. Jenny used to come home. The army buses would come and pick up the children.
The French army buses.
French army buses at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they would go to school. And then they'd bring them home at 12 o'clock every day. Then they would go back to school. They'd come back at 2 and pick them up, and then they'd bring them home at 5. And they had Thursday afternoon and Sunday off. The rest of the time they were in school.
In school, right.
And it was difficult for us to get used to not having a weekend.
Right, right. That's the way the French do it. They sure do. Well, now, you finished that year there. Or
Yes,
18
we had a
months.
year there.
Yeah. And then you went back to Heidelberg.
No.
From there.
As a matter of fact, when we were there, I attended the University of Freiburg, the Albert Ludwig
Great,
University,
yeah.
which I thought was a wonderful experience.
You attended it with German instruction.
Well, I thought I was going to. The course I signed up for was German history in the 20th century, and I wanted to see how a German university taught that particular subject.
Sure.
And the first day of class, found out the professor was from UCLA, and he taught the class in English. So it was quite an experience. The first day of class, when he walked in, everybody picked up their books and started banging the tables. And I thought, what have I gotten myself into? Are they going to have a riot? And this was the biggest clatter I'd ever heard. And they drummed the professor to the platform. This was supposed to be a sign of respect, which really was shocking. I had never seen this before. But when the bell rang 2 hours later, whether he was in mid-sentence or what, he got up and left.
Just got up and walked out.
Just got up and walked out, whether he was finished or not. But they extended this courtesy when he came in, but at the end of class, it was over.
Take off, right.
It was amazing.
Was he teaching for UCLA or was he for the University of Maryland?
This was in the French zone, so no, he was
So it
teaching.
wouldn't have been
It was an
strictly-
exchange tour between UCLA and the University of
I
Freiburg,
see. Oh.
which was called the Albert Ludwig University.
Uh-huh. I see. All right. Well, then from there, from Freiburg, where did you go next?
We went from Freiburg to Paris.
To Paris. Now, I want to know when your son appeared.
Marty was born in Paris.
So he went to Paris. Okay. And what was the assignment that Bill had in Paris?
Let me see. Well, Bill was in Eisenhower's old headquarters at the Blockhouse, and he was the signal
At the Blockhouse at
right off the Arc de Triomphe.
right, but
in Paris.
But the location.
It was right downtown in Paris, right off the Arc de Triomphe.
Uh-huh. Do you remember the street?
Oh, I should, but I can't.
Maybe it'll come
It
to us,
doesn't
yeah.
come.
In the Eisenhower
It
headquarters.
was one of the spirals that
one of the
go
spokes.
off.
Off of the arc. Mm-hmm. All right. And what was he doing there now?
He was the head of the signal office in Paris.
Right there. Uh-huh.
And he did the negotiations with the French government for communications lines.
Was that on the Champs-Élysées?
Just off.
Just off of that.
Just
one.
off.
Yeah. Now, where did you live?
Well,
What
we
section?
lived in a hotel for 3 weeks, and our French friends from Freiburg found us an apartment. So we lived across the river in Saint-Cloud.
Now, wasn't that convenient and nice that you had the French friends help you out with that?
Find a house.
Yeah. Oh,
And
my
in
goodness.
Parc de la Bérengère, these were apartments, but they were condominiums, about 11 stories high, and it was just like a great big park with playgrounds and tennis courts, and
Saint-Cloud.
it was beautiful. Very close to the Val d'Or train station, so you could just take the train into Paris.
So your proficiency in French at that time?
It improved a little. Jenny was wonderful, and Bill was very good at it. I was amazed at even how his rapidity of speaking picked up.
Uh-huh. I see. Now, your son, what did you name him?
We named him Martin Glenn, and he was born on January 4th, 1961.
In the military hospital?
In the American hospital in Paris at Neuilly.
Uh-huh. And
I spent 10 weeks with them.
you spent...
Waiting for him
Oh, you mean
in the hospital.
before he was born? So you must have had a difficulty where you were about to lose him or something like that?
Yes.
A premature birth? So they hospitalized you until you
And
went
then we
term.
thought he never was going to arrive.
Yeah, sure. All right. So he was born there in Paris. And how long was Bill's assignment there?
Well, Bill was ready to retire, and so he had put in his request for retirement, and he went in August to take his retirement physical, as many did. There were many retiring.
Uh-huh.
And the password among everybody was, when you saw everybody, well, did he pass? And everybody'd say, oh, yes. And Bill didn't pass. And they had sent his records to Walter Reed to have them evaluated. And while they were gone, the Berlin Wall went up. And all retirements that had not been completely processed, were canceled.
So he didn't get to retire as soon as he wanted then.
No.
Oh,
So
I see.
in October, we came back to the United States, but Bill didn't have any orders because they had thought he was going to retire.
Oh, I
And they
see.
came on board the ship in New York with his orders
I see.
for the satellite communications station.
Where?
Well, at first it was Fort Dix, and so Bill went down to the Pentagon to talk to them, and they said they didn't have a commander for either station. And the satellite business was brand
Just
new
getting
back
started,
in
wasn't it? Mhm.
61, so they were really pioneers, and they said they didn't have a commander for the station at Camp Roberts. And so Bill said, my wife would love to go back to California, and as long as it doesn't make any difference. So the orders were changed for Camp Roberts in California. And that's how we got to Paso Robles.
Oh, I see. Well, now let's back up to Paris a little bit. By the time you left there, how old was Jenny?
Jenny was 7.
All right. Now, where did she go to school in Paris?
She went to Garches to school.
Garches, which was
The Paris
the
American School.
Right. Uh-huh. And where was that school located?
It was located midway between downtown Paris and I'm trying to think of the. It wasn't Camp Deloge. It was
Where
where
was,
we did all our shopping outside of Paris.
how
It was
far
a
was
big
it from
army.
UCOM headquarters? Not very far.
No,
No.
but
And-
Shape was its Camp Deloge.
Yeah. Right.
And this other one was straight out.
Right. Now, SHAPE, which later was moved to Belgium, is the acronym for Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers, Europe. Yeah, which
Right.
was located there in Paris.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's out on that end of town, you know, in Saint Cloud and
Yes.
all that sort of thing. Is just where the Garches school was. Do you remember how they spelled Garches?
Garches.
Right. A little. People listening to this in the future, you know, will wonder just what it is, and that's why I pull these out. You
Yeah.
see.
Well, I thought the fascinating thing about Garches, or the Paris American School, every student was picked up at home and delivered to home. And the first time I went out to school, to see 66 buses lined up in the schoolyard, and then they stopped the traffic on the main avenue while this convoy of buses
They,
poured out of the schoolyard when
The
the
army
school day
buses,
was over. Army buses.
quite a number of those army buses, I don't know at that time or not, but they had contracted with French drivers to
Oh, I
drive
can
because
believe
they
that,
were
yes.
frequent with the streets, and they just didn't turn them over
Right.
to the GIs to drive them, you know. Later on they did quite a bit. But all right, so that's where Ginny went to school, was at Garches. And
Yes.
now she'd had her earlier experience. She quite an introduction to French and German, playing on the playground, you know, with the
Yes.
children.
Well, she when
and-
her preschool was in Bad Tolz,
Right.
in a German school run by Catholic nuns, and the little boys were separated from the little girls,
Uh-huh.
and it was all day, from 8 o'clock in the morning till 5 in the afternoon, and the children took naps. They fed them soup and bread for lunch, and the little girls learned how to sew in the afternoon.
Isn't
She
that
learned how to
interesting?
make buttonholes and
Yeah. Isn't
all
that
this, but
interesting?
they had
Yeah.
their studies in the morning.
Where is she now?
She's in Salinas, California.
Is she married?
California. She's married and to Richard Brown, and she has 2 children, Katie and Bill. Katie's 14 and Bill is 11.
I see. Does she reflect every now and then on some of those European experiences as a young child? And she would remember a lot about that. She'd remember a lot about Garches, wouldn't she?
Well, she doesn't seem to remember until we look at slides. And she's not sure whether she remembers or whether she remembers hearing us talk about them. But
Right,
she's
right.
still proficient with her French.
With her French, I see. All right. So when you when you say the reason you got to Paso Robles when you returned.
Yes.
What was the reason?
Bill
Bill
went
was
to
it
build and command the satellite communications site at Camp Roberts.
right. Mm-hmm.
The project was called Advent,
Uh-huh.
and Advent was the name of the satellite. And it was pure gold, and we didn't have a booster to lift it into space. So it was revised to, and they built, the new satellite was SATCOM.
Yeah, I see. Now, when you were there, and you see that's the reason why you went to Paso Robles
Yes.
and bought a home in Paso Robles. How long was he in the military before he retired then?
Well, we were there 4 years, and he retired.
And then he got out this time.
Well, we
Yeah.
liked Paso Robles so well, we decided he had enough time, and it was time to retire.
So
and
they
so
let-
we
they-
retired and stayed
They
there.
let him retire this time.
Yes.
Yeah, I see. So you stayed right there. What did he wind up doing?
Well, he retired for a year, and he had all these little projects, and when he got finished with all of his little projects, he said, one morning at breakfast, Marty was still very young, and we were sitting there having a second cup of coffee, and Marty looked over and said, Dad, when are you going to get untired?
Untired?
Untired, because Dad was retired.
I see.
And so
Now, how old
when-
was Marty here at that time?
About 4.5 or 5. And so when he got down to go play and we had another cup of coffee, Bill said, you know, this is unhealthy to raise a child who never sees his father work or never remembers seeing his father work. And the next statement was, what do you think about a bookshop? That's the one thing we've missed since we came to California, to Paso Robles.
They didn't have one there?
They didn't
did
have a bookshop in town.
Oh, I see.
And I agreed. I said that would be wonderful. By 11 o'clock that morning, we had a building rented. And it took us a month to get everything organized and our supply of books in. And in a month's time, the doors were open of St. George's Bookshop.
Now, what year would this be?
That was May of '66.
66. And so that's what you and Bill did.
Together,
you
it was
stayed, and
wonderful.
you had this bookshop.
Yes.
And Marty went to school there, of course, and Virginia did.
Yes.
Did they both graduate through high school in Paso Robles?
Both of them,
Went to-
and Jenny was valedictorian of her class in 1972. Marty graduated in 1979,
Uh-huh.
and both of them went on to USC.
They both went to USC, where their
Mhm.
mother did, and
And their grandfather.
their grandfather, USC tradition,
Yes,
the grandfather on your side,
great-grandfather.
right? Your stepdad, or,
No,
or
my
your real.
my great-grandfather. My grandfather.
Your
My grandfather.
your biological grandfather, right?
Yes,
Uh-huh.
my mother's father.
I see. Okay, so it comes
So
down
it
through
was
your
a
mother.
tradition.
Yeah,
Yes.
your mother side of the family
Mhm.
with USC. Okay, so they went and both graduated through USC.
Well,
did they?
no.
Well,
Marty
Bill.
graduated from St. Mary's at Moraga. Just
We have to
a
take
few
another break.
months
Just
ago.
a second now. Hey, so he started at SC,
Yes.
and then but finished at
At St. Mary's in Moraga.
in where?
In Moraga,
Moraga.
California.
Okay, and St. Mary's Liberal Arts College, or yeah, all right. And-
I'm not
Yeah.
really sure. It was
Okay.
just last month.
Oh, just recently. Well, a lot of people delay
It
their.
took him a little time.
Yeah, but now Ginny, she went through and graduated
In 4
it
years.
in 4 years. What did she prepare for?
She majored in journalism. She had a 4-year scholarship in journalism, in public relations.
I see.
And then she went to work for the Salinas, Californian newspaper and worked for them for about 17 years. And she retired and decided to stay home and be a mother.
I see. But she got married while she was in,
in
Salinas.
She met Richard in college,
At
and they were
USC.
married just after they graduated.
I see. All right.
They both graduated the same
So
year.
she's now a housewife, is that right?
A housewife who has about 8 separate jobs.
That's quite a bit. And her husband's still working too, and that's
Her husband's in the produce business.
Oh, I see. And Marty
West Wind Farms.
up in Salinas. And Marty is he following any particular career field?
Marty's in the produce business too. He works for Fresh Express.
I see.
In sales.
I see. All right. Well, that brings us pretty much up almost to the end. I want to ask you when did Bill pass on?
Bill passed on in 1975.
1975. Is he buried in
Arlington National Cemetery.
In Arlington, I see. That's appropriate then.
Mm-hmm.
And since he passed on, Betty Lou, what have you been doing? Have you been working anywhere or following any hobbies?
I continued with the bookshop until 1979, and then I retired. And after that, as much as I loved that, then life got rather exciting. I made a trip to the Himalayas. I went trekking in the Himalayas and spent a month in India. My trek was probably the most strenuous thing I've ever done in my life, but the most rewarding, because I think those things that require the most effort often give the most reward. And I worked on a dolphin research project that was shown on KQED at one time. And I've done a lot of traveling. I've been to Egypt and to India, Nepal. I've been to China. I spent some time in the Philippines.
Well, you've been traveling quite a bit then.
Yes.
Now, did you sell your bookshop in 79?
No, I closed my bookshop. I did toy with selling it, but I decided that it was better to close it.
Close it instead of selling it, huh?
Mm-hmm.
I see.
I just put everything on sale
and sold out.
And sold out.
I see.
And the publishers allowed me to return most of the
I see.
merchandise. They were very, very good to me.
And are you still living in the same house that you and Bill bought when he?
Yes, that we were only going to live in for the 4 years or 3 years possibly, that we were going to be in Paso Robles, and I'm still there.
Yes.
And then I did go back to school in, I think, 87, and got my master's degree in philosophy.
Well, that's wonderful.
With emphasis on Asian studies.
That's wonderful. Where did you do this? What school?
At World University of America in Ojai, California.
I see. Did you feel a little guilty in not going down to USC to do that?
No, because Ojai taught what I wanted to learn.
Good. Yeah. Well, that's wonderful.
They gave the courses, and they had what I wanted to learn, and I figured after 45 years I was entitled to just study what I wanted to learn about.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. Okay. Well, that's. I'm glad we have this on film. I want to say for the record that Betty Lou St. George is a member of the American Overseas Schools Archive, and she's also joined the newly formed American Overseas Schools Historical Society. And she's here visiting us, visiting the archives, which are temporarily housed at 13292 West Holly Street in Goodyear, Arizona. We don't know where they're going to be permanently located, but they'll find a home pretty soon. And we're just very fortunate in having Betty Lou come and visit the archives and be our house guest for a few days and help us do some entertaining, which included the director of Dodds and her communications officer last night in a nice party, wasn't it?
It was
Betty
a
Lou?
delightful
It was just
party. We had a
real nice.
wonderful time.
Right. So Betty Lou had this experience overseas with the dependent schools. She met her husband overseas, and she traveled around the world with him, Europe at least, you know, and then came back to California. And we look forward to keeping her very much involved in the Historical Society and the archives. And we want to thank you, Betty Lou, for what you do and for coming and visiting us.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. It was a delight.
Thank you very much.
In the tables, we will get a grade equivalent, an instructional range from what would be easy to what would be difficult, and a age equivalent, the developmental scores, those are called. Okay, the next column we're going to go to a table that will give us the average cluster score for the subject, and we need to make a choice about whether or not we choose to compare the subject to his age or his grade peers. So there are two tables. If you want to compare the subject to all the kids in the 4th grade of 5th month, you turn to the grade tables. If you want to compare them to all the kids who are 11 years, 3 months old, you turn to the age. And you will get a cluster score, and this cluster score is the average. And then the height of this instrument is based on comparing this person to the average in their group, whether we choose their age group or their grade group. Okay. So after we have the cluster score they actually got, the cluster score that an average person got, the question is, how different is this person from the average? And they will be different, either the same, better, or worse. So we'll be working with positive and negative numbers. If they are above the average, they get a plus however many points they are above the average. If they are below the average cluster score, we find the difference, and they are that number of points below. So in this instance, Tad, with his achievement in reading of 457, that is 22 points below the average end of the 2nd grader in reading. Okay, and the negative sign is indicating the below. And we're going to use that cluster score difference to get a percentile rank and range for that. So we'll go to the tables, and the percentile tables, I think the way to best think about the scoring is to always think about what you're comparing. So across all of the clusters and all of the batteries, we're comparing the subject actual performance to the subject's the average performance in their peer group. And what is that difference? And every time we look for a percentile rank, we have to know that different skills and abilities develop differently. So that comparison will be different for each ability. So we're not going to go to one table that will give us the percentiles, but every time we change a subject or an area, we need a percentile table that's for that subject or area. Okay, and then we'll also get the percentile rank range. Now that instructional range and the percentile rank range, in my opinion, are one of the nicest things that Woodcock built into this instrument, because what those do is continually put before us a reminder of the fact that whenever we test, there are lots of things going on in that test situation. And we get a test score, and that's an attained test score. What we call a subject's true test score, their true ability, a measure of what they really can do, it's very difficult to get that on any given one-time basis. And so there is a procedure that's called standard error of measurement. And that's taking into account some of the error factors in measurement itself, okay, in a standardized way. And so that's telling us we know that this subject's true performance lies somewhere in this range as opposed to on this mark. I think that's a really nice thing he's done. So we don't know that this child is at the 31st percentile a point in time. We know that this person functions most likely within this range. The band here, in terms of how wide that band is telling us that we know, in this case we're using one standard error of measurement, so we know that about 67% of the time that that's going to be true. 2 out of 3 times when we test the subject, they're going to fall in that range. 1 out of 3 times when we test them, they may fall outside of that range. Okay, so if you think about that, it just reminds us of the impreciseness of our test measures. Okay, the RPI is a way of interpreting what does it mean if you are second grade, in second grade, and you're at the end of second grade. In this case, Tad was 2.9, and he has a score of 2.0. When we put him in his regular classroom and regular class material, what does that mean? Okay, so that RPI is a real helpful indicator or predictor of how well this student performed in their regular class setting with regular class materials compared to an average person in that group. So we're going to say for Tad in reading compared to other second graders, end of the year second graders in reading, when we give Tad end of the second grade reading material that an average second grader would do with 90% accuracy or 90% success, we're going to predict that he's going to be able to do that with about 45% accuracy. Yes.
So what is RPI?
The performance relative, the question is what does RPI stand for? The label stands for Relative Performance Index, and what it is indicating is the performance relative to the group the person is in. The comparison basis is what an average person in that group would do with 90% accuracy. We predict their accuracy will be about this. So it's that kind of comparison. Any question about that? If you are familiar with the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test, they have a mastery score at grade, I think it's called, and that instrument uses this concept. And in the manual accompanying the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test, there's a nice description of that kind of score. Yes?
Do a lot of other tests use RPI?
Question is, do a lot of other tests use RPIs? Not at this point in time. It's a new kind of measure. And it's because the instrument was based on a particular rash model, which allows them to determine both the difficulty level of the items and the ability level of the person taking the test, and the items are sequenced in such a way that they're able to predict how well one is going to do. Okay. Now, it's important for you to know that this prediction, okay, we can use that generally, and the prediction, though, is going to hold true to the extent that the kinds of tasks in the second grade reader are like the kinds of tasks in this reading test. It's that kind of, you know, it's based on this reading test. This is what we would predict would happen in the classroom. And to the degree that the curriculum materials in the classroom are like the kinds of tasks that were on the test, that prediction would tend to hold true. I just want to say one more thing about that RPI. We may not be able to do a whole lot with it now, but I would encourage you to look into that area because I believe that that's one of the most helpful scores in interpretation for classroom teachers, particularly with those mainstream special education students. Okay? Because I can say to a 10th grade teacher that Harold is reading at a second grade level. And that teacher knows Harold's going to have a lot of trouble. Okay, but if I say to that teacher, Harold is reading at a second grade level, what that means is when you give Harold your 10th grade literature book, his chances of being successful are about 1%. You can expect him to be able to do about 2% of that task. And I find that that's a very graphic descriptor for the same phenomenon, because the teacher's saying, as I give this material, and the teacher's responsibility is to control the success level for the student. So it makes it very clear to the teacher what that below grade means in terms of I'm giving you something and I know as I hand it to you what your chances of success are, that they're very, very low. And then you can talk about the implications of that. Okay.
At
Yes.
the same time, do you endorse that for use with parents? Or do you think that, again, is getting too much into numbers and instilling that fear, again, that you mentioned?
The question is, would the RPI be helpful with parents? My personal bias with parents is to use percentile rankings just because they're the most straightforward. The kinds of standardized tests that are given to parents are usually stated in percentile terms, and once you clarify with them that you're not talking about percentage correct, but what percentile means in terms of their ranking within a group, you've kind of conveyed, when you convey to the parents that in a group of 100 kids, 98 kids are going to do better than yours, they have trouble. I think it would be really helpful as the teacher worked with the parent to explain this in terms of that, just as I have. I think the explanation in a way is fairly simple. And so you can say every time the teacher gives him regular grade work, this is his chance of being successful and what the implications of that are. I think it's a manageable explanation for parents. The functioning level is just a descriptor of that RPI. It's just a verbal label. So if you're only able to do about 45% with 45% success, what an average child can do with 90% success, you have a moderate deficit in that area, or you are average in that area. We recommend if in your books they use low average and high average, or above average and below average rather, and we recommend that that be translated into low average and high average, as statistically on the normal curve, what is called above average here is within the broad average range, within the first standard deviation. It's broad average and it's at the high end of average. It's above average in the sense that it's above the exact midpoint, which would be the 50th percentile. Okay, so if you think of 50 as the middle, then as soon as you get to 51, 52, 53, you're above average in that sense. But the average population goes from about the 16th to the 84th percentile. That's what is considered the broad average range of the population. Okay. Now, there's not a space for standard score on the protocol, but we do show people where to get that information, and I think that was a situation where it was not foreseen the rage and the use of standard scores that would take the nation at the time the test came out, and there's been a real trend toward moving toward standard scores since 1978. And so for now, we just teach people to put that SS, which stands for standard score, and to figure that out, because many of your districts may know are looking for a point discrepancy, and when they're using a point discrepancy, they're looking at the difference in standard score points.
Is it in, I'm sorry, is it in the ED time.
Yes,
Like
what's
the
up?
announcement.
Let's take a look now at just the scoring for the achievement. And so you will want the manual this time for the achievement. And I will put the transparency up, but at this point you'll see one of the problems with the scoring for people is the number of numbers on a table and the this will just give you a little bit of the notion of the steps involved in the scoring process, and so when people are talking about either the tediousness of it or the margin of error when someone is handling, if you look at the number of tables, the number of numbers and the size of the numbers, and immediately people begin to either use a marker this way and this way both to be finding their places. Okay, so what we're going to do in this case is I'm going to take Tad's raw score in subtest 13 was 19. Why don't you do this on your achievement booklet here? Put the raw scores in for the reading cluster. Okay, right now. So for subtest 13, we're going to put in 19. Subtest 14 is 6. And subtest 15 is 9. Just put those 3 raw scores in. Okay, and then you'll complete this cluster going across, so you'll see the process. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do here is look up that raw score on the first subtest of 19. We're going to come across and make sure, if you look across the top, you'll see the different clusters, and then you'll see the subtests within the clusters. So remember, the part score is different each time. You need to be sure you're in the right place. So a raw score of 19 on subtest 13 will get a part score of 144. And we'll write that in the part score space. Okay, the raw score of 6 on word attack. So we'll find the raw score of 6, go over to the word attack column, take the part score 158 and write it in. And then the raw score of 9, passage comprehension, go to 9, go over to passage comprehension, part score is 155. Okay, and then we have those 3 part scores, and to get the cluster score, we're just going to total those. So we'll add those 3 numbers, that'll give us the reading cluster score. Now what we're going to do is finish scoring the reading cluster, but ordinarily when someone is scoring this test, if you notice how the tables are set up, they would go through and get all the part scores. And so when they're filling out this answer sheet, basically they'll be filling out this much, and then this much all the way down, and then this much all the way down, and then the next table will take us to here all the way down, okay, as opposed to working all the way across here, which is what we're going to do. We're not going to do it the most efficient way, but we'll do it the sample way. Okay, okay, so we have a cluster score here. And if you look at the next table now, we'll notice the tables are all very well labeled. So we've got table B, grade and age scores for reading. And notice on the protocol, it's going to be labeled table B is what you're going to write for the table you're going to use for this space. So someone can always check with what they're writing in and make sure that they're using the correct table to match. Okay. And for table B, we'll simply look up that cluster score 457, and we'll see a grade score, and then we'll see an instructional range, and then we'll see an age score. And we're scoring a second grader, so we're using somebody 34 years or younger. Okay. Okay, is everybody with me so far? So you would be completing this as far as here? Okay. Now let me just point out, if you look down the column on Table B, and you notice where we start out with the lowest cluster score, and we have 1.0, 1.0, until we get to about cluster score of 407. And then we start with 1.1. Okay, but you see that little superscript? Okay, little numbers. You will very often be asked what that number means, and so I think it will be important to know that when we get a grade equivalent of 1.0, this means a beginning first grader, no months in the first grade. And this means an average first grader. This means the average person. When we get a grade equivalent of 5th year, 2nd month, this means the average student at the 2nd month in 5th grade. That grade equivalent score you could think of as the 50th percentile. It's the average. So that means anytime you have a student that gets a 5.2 grade equivalent, that's a 50th percentile score. Half the kids are going to be above that, and half of them are going to be below that, because that's what 50th percentile means. It's right in the middle. Okay, follow that? Okay, you're lost. Let's say in this room we all got 12.9 grade score, because that's as high a grade score as you can get at the end of 12th grade. And we tested everybody, and that's where we all came out in terms of grade equivalent. But I dare say there are some differences in this group. Okay, in terms of our cluster score that got that grade equivalent, there are going to be some point differences. So there are going to be some people that are at the high end or the low end within that score. That's the average or the midpoint score. But all of the kids at that point, to get that 12.9, we averaged this bunch of scores. Okay? And 12.9 is the average or the midpoint score. Okay? But don't forget that we got that midpoint by averaging the highs and lows in our group. Okay? So that means in this group, if we all get 12.9, and that's a midpoint, if we were to look more carefully at the scores and put the actual scores down and put them in percentile ranks, half the scores would be above and half the scores would be below, because that was the average. Okay, that's the notion, and that holds true for any grade equivalent, which is why grade equivalents are tricky with parents, because if you have a student in the first month of 6th grade, that's the average, half the kids in that class or in that group are below and half are above. That's normal. But don't try to tell a parent that it's the kids within the normal if they're 1 month behind in reading. They have a hard time with that. Okay, so basically what you need to know is for the kids that are just ready to start 1st grade and for the people who are exiting 12th grade, those are 2 points at which we might want to distinguish within that population further. Okay, to say 5.2 is sufficient for the middle kids who are still in school, and that's average. But for kids that are ready to start school or for people who are exiting, we might want to know where within that population they'll fall. So at this level, those little numbers will indicate anybody who is less than the average, below the 50th percentile ready. And so you'll see those little numbers indicate the percentile rankings. So when you get something like this, that's telling you, if we only looked at the grade equivalent, we might say this student is ready to begin 1st grade. But if we look at that little 2, we say, of all the kids ready to begin 1st grade, 98 out of 100 are going to do better than this kid. You see, this kid is in the 2nd percentile for all the kids that are ready. That's the child you may want to hold back. And you wouldn't get that information if you only looked at grade equivalents. Okay, the same would be true at the upper end of 12.9 is the highest grade equivalent, but there are variations within that group, and in that case, we're usually interested in who's above average. Okay, kids who are going to go on to college, so you're either an average person at that age, or you tend toward above average within that population. So these numbers will go from 51 to 99, and they indicate within all the people who have completed the 12th grade, within that population, you were at what point above average. Okay, we use table B, the grade and age score. So we're that far, and then the next one we're going to get a cluster. Your table's going to go in order now for cluster scores for math, written language, and knowledge. So we're going to skip over to tables F and G. And we want to look up a cluster score for grade. So we're going to find the actual grade placement of the student we're scoring. So for Tad, G and H, but we're going to make a decision. In this case, I think we used grade, so we'll use table G. We usually will do one or the other. Here's the point at which we're comparing the subject to either grade or age. So the choice. If we choose grade, we're going to find the subject's grade, which was 2.9, and we're going to take the average reading score. Okay, no, we are taking where he is, because we want to compare this person to where is he, not how he did. Okay, and that's really an important thing. That's why people have to conceptually know what they're comparing. So at this point, you're comparing them to the average, their peer. So you take where their placement is by age or grade. So we take 2.9, and we find the average reading cluster score for 2.9 is 479. Okay, and then we'll look at the difference between what the student got and what the average is at that grade. And we're going to note there's 22 points difference, and he's below. Follow that? Okay, and then the next table will tell us what that 22 points, how he will rank with his peers with that 22. So we'll turn over to table I, and notice that is for reading and that is for grade, and they're for percentiles. You will be reading for grade, reading for age. There'll be a different percentile table for each thing that you're comparing. So we'll look up the score difference here, which is a negative 22. But we also need to look across the top of the table and find wherever the grade placement range falls. So you need to look at across the top, first of all, to find where the 2.9 placement is. And then find the 22-point difference. So in this case, we're going to look across the top, find the grade placement, and then come down the left to find the point difference of 22, and that will give us the percentile rank and the range. Okay, if you turn to page 118 in the Achievement Manual now, you'll have a table W, and that is where we'll get the Relative Performance Index. And we'll get that by looking up that cluster score difference again. So we'll look up a minus 22. And we'll notice the RPI is 45. And the 90 is already written for us. Okay? And then that functioning level, you'll see the letters that indicate. So at the bottom, the code is there, very superior, superior. And again, we would alter above to high, average, average, alter the word below to low average. Just change it so that it's reading low average and a high average rather than above and below. Okay, and then on the next table, table X, we have several choices of standard scores to use, and the one that is most commonly used is the second one over, where the mean is 100 and the SD, or standard deviation, is 15. So that's the one we usually recommend. The reason for that is that most other tests in the Wechsler are going to use that as the mean and standard deviation. And other tests to which we'll be comparing this in terms of standard scores more frequently will be on that scale. Okay, so we're going to use Tad's percentile rank, which was 14. And so his standard score in reading would be 84. The question is, what does the standard score really mean? Each of the kind of scores give us different kinds of information about a subject's performance. A standard score is a way of taking different scores from different instruments or from different parts within the same instrument and putting them on the same ruler. So rather than saying it's this grade equivalent and that grade equivalent, or this grade equivalent and this percentile rank, remember those, because abilities develop differently at different levels, that percentile ranking can vary. So a 50th percentile in reading, a student at the 50th percentile in reading could be, in terms of grade equivalent, a grade below. In terms of math, they could be a grade above. That 50th percentile, we don't know how that converts in different areas. A standard score is the way of putting scores on the same ruler. And the importance of the standard score and why you are seeing it used increasingly is that whenever we're going to compare, that is the score of choice. Because that's the way to put everything into the same language in order to talk about what is the difference between these two things. We cannot do that validly or accurately if we use grade or age or percentiles. Those other scores give us information standard scores won't. Okay, but a standard score is the basis of comparison of performance on different tests. That's the key idea to remember. If you want to compare, standard score is the best kind of score to use to compare. And that is why you'll see needing to make a comparison between what a student can do and what they're expected to do and how different is that. People are looking for standard score differences, not the differences in the other scores. Any other question about that? Okay. Good. Okay, now we'd like to take a look at each of the profiles to the degree that we can. I think it's more important that you know what those are. So if you take the Okay, if we go back now to the cognitive protocol, this profile will give us an overall view of the subject's cluster score performance in the different clusters on the cognitive battery. Okay, so it's going to be a nice graphic picture of overall cluster score performance. And so we're going to see for TAD, when we have completed this complete scoring, his percentile rank in that broad cognitive ability score was from about 91 to 96. Okay, so this band, these numbers going from 1 to 99, those are representing percentiles. And what we chart on this is the percentile range. Remember how we got a rank, but then we got a range. And so the band is going to show one end of the range and the other end of the range. We just mark those 2 points on this scale and shade the difference between the two. That's going to hold true for each of the clusters in this area. So we will have scored all of them, we will have had a percentile range, and we would look up for each cluster and say, mark the percentile range, and then shade the band for each of the clusters. Okay, so for our reading achievement, which is the one we did, we can put that on if we look at the cover of the reading achievement. It's a similar profile, but for the achievement clusters. So for TAD, if we looked at his reading achievement, the percentile ranking was, the range was 10. So we'd come under reading and we would mark 10, and we would approximate 18, and we would shade that band, and that would indicate his performance in reading. Okay. Okay. If we go back to looking at TAD's completed cognitive profile then, okay, the next thing we need to know is when we've got this collection of bands on the profile, okay, in order to interpret the bands, we have 3 rules. And the 3 rules for interpreting bands are important, and they remain true for any time you are interpreting the bands on any of the profiles. So it won't matter if we're talking about the bands here, or the bands on the achievement, or the bands on the subtest, which we'll look at in a minute. The same 3 rules will hold true. Okay, and here are the rules. We'll look at the first rule, and that says, if the bands overlap, assume there's no difference in the abilities in those 2 clusters. And by overlap, if you think of your bands, okay, as think of my hands as bands, overlap means any time We're not putting one on top of the other because we're having reading here and math here. But if they overlap, it means if they were in the same place, they'd be overlapping. Okay? So this is a case where bands are overlapping. And whenever that is the case, we can look at any two things and compare, and we can say, is there a difference in the subject's performance in those two areas? And if the bands overlap, we assume there is no difference. Okay. So if we look at Tad's profile, okay, would we say there's a difference between his oral language and verbal abilities? No. Between his verbal and broad reasoning? No. Okay, so anywhere. Between his broad cognitive and broad reasoning? No. Okay, so you have the notion there. Just, you can take any two things anywhere. If they overlap, you say there's no difference. He's performing about the same in those two areas. All right. Now I'd like you to come down and look at the third one, which is the other extreme. Because number one is there's no difference, and number three is there is a real difference. And it's a difference that's statistically significant. Even after we take into account the sources of error within test measurement, there seems to be a real difference in how this person performs in this area and performs in that. And a real difference is indicated when the distance between the bands, so here are my two bands, and this time I'm going to look at the difference between my two fingertips here. And how wide is that difference? How wide is the band of the difference? Okay? So here the band of the difference is getting wider, it's getting narrower. Okay? If the band difference is more than the width of the widest of the two you're comparing. Okay, if it's wider than the widest, so you have three things to look at. How wide one band is, how wide the other band is, how wide the difference. Is the difference band wider than the biggest or the widest of the other two? Then you say, there's a real difference in how the student performs in these two areas. So again, if we look at Tad, an example of something that's really different is his reading aptitude. If we're looking at the solid black squares, just use the solid blacks. Perceptual speed and broad cognitive, although it's kind of a little bit hard to tell, isn't it? Because of the difference on the protocol there and the width of that perceptual speed. But that looks like it's running pretty close to a difference. Okay. If we looked at that reading aptitude with the broad cognitive, that's real clear. Okay. That kind of thing. We don't want you to put reading aptitude on the cover profile with this, which is why I was going to try to ignore that. That shouldn't be on there. Okay, but that's the notion. Okay, and then the step to the rule 2, that's the maybe area. There may, and that's how we would word it, there may be a difference. So we're going to say, if they overlap, no difference. If this width is wider than the widest of the two you're comparing, there is a real difference. And when there is the separation, but it's not wide enough to say there is a real difference, then we're in the maybe area. And think about that maybe area, the way I word it is think about that as a continuum. So this is a maybe area, but it's much closer to overlapping than it is to the separation. Okay, so you're starting out with, you know, this is no difference, and here you're beginning with the possibly a difference. And your possibility is getting greater as your band is getting greater until it meets the, yes, we can say there is a difference. So when people are doing write-ups, we say there may be a difference, or, you know, there possibly be a difference, and their wording will qualify whether it's most likely there's a difference or tending towards. That middle ground is a continuum. Okay, and these three rules remain true of any of the bands on the profile. Okay, if you turn to the back cover of the cognitive booklet, this is the place where we can do subtest interpretation on the battery to see what the difference is within the cluster score. Because cluster scores can mask performance. If we get a reading cluster score, we know that's their overall reading, but we don't know about strengths and weaknesses within that area. So the subtest is the place, profile is the place where you can look at strengths and weaknesses within the cluster. And the way to do this is, again, we'll have the raw scores for the subtest here. And then you're going to have a band here, and you're going to have numbers above it and numbers below it. So just kind of look at it and get that idea. And what we're going to do in this case is take the raw score of 13, for example, and we're going to come across in that band, and we're going to see where 13 would be above the band and make a little mark. And we're going to put where 13 would be below the band and make a little mark. And we're going to shade the difference between the two. It's really simple once you see how the numbers are in the band. Okay, do you see that? And each band has the numbers above and below, and they're in different positions, you can see. Okay, and then after we've charted the bands then for all the subtests, then we can look at TAD's subtest performance, and we use our same three rules, okay? What seem to be strengths and what seem to be weaknesses. And the line you will see drawn down here, this line is showing where his grade placement is, and so we can look at all the bands that cross his grade placement are telling us that performance, subtest performance, is right at his grade placement. This band is showing his broad cognitive ability score, and remember, he was brighter, so even though if you look at his bands for the grade he's in, he's doing fine because he's got these things that look real strong. But when we look at his broad cognitive skills, some of them begin to fall to the left of the band, which is telling us that he's bright. So even though he's doing okay for his age, we're expecting more from him, and compared to his ability, then he's got some weaknesses. Yes?
I don't see where you did error for the broad cognitive.
Okay, at the top there, the question is where did that arrow for broad cognitive ability come? And that's, I neglected to point out the two continuums at the top. You'll see this labeled cognitive ability, and you'll see those numbers going across 576, 525. That's using the cognitive cluster score, broad cognitive cluster score. His was not reading now. Broad cognitive was a 487. 487. Okay, that's coming from his full-scale score here. We didn't do that. We didn't score that cluster, okay?
Yeah.
So that's just putting his full-scale cluster score there. And then you see a grade equivalent line. You can use the grade equivalent line, and you see that's at about 2.9, because that's where he really was, and that's the way to look at him compared to his grade. Okay, if we look at the bottom profile here, the main thing about this profile is this is the one place where we put together the information from the cognitive and the achievement portion. And this profile This is the place where we're saying we're using the aptitude cluster scores from the cognitive, and we're predicting achievement. Remember that notion? The 4 subtests in reading are going to predict this student's aptitude for reading. And then we've given an achievement test, and we've seen what is their achievement in reading. So this profile is comparing the student to their own aptitude. And this is the heart of the comparison in determination of learning disability. So this profile is the heart of that whole issue, because this is the place on this instrument where we're looking at the student's actual achievement compared to their expected achievement based on aptitude. And you'll just see here that they're going to take some information from part 1 and 2. So you'll notice the first thing is what Tad's cluster score, what his achievement score in reading was, what his predicted score in reading was. And that's going to be from where we score the aptitude clusters on the cognitive. It'll say expected reading score. So this is what he actually did. This is what we expected him to do because of his reading aptitude. What was the difference between how well he's doing and how well he ought to be doing based on ability in that area? Okay, and this is where this student on this test would indicate a severe deficit in reading. Now, this would be one step in the identification process. According to this, now we have data that says a severe deficit, statistically significant difference between aptitude and achievement in the reading area, one of the things required for eligibility. But we'd also look at other things. Now, the advantage to this, I think, Florine, if we have just a few minutes, do you think I'll point out the... Okay. Let me just talk about this a little bit, because that's kind of the key of the test, and that is this, I think, is where the heart of some of the discussion you'll hear in the field about the test and how the test should be used, and I think most of what seems to be controversial, if that's not too strong a word, seems to center around this notion of determining a difference between ability and achievement, and what should we use, and is this any better than the Wechsler for determining that, and those kinds of issues. And there are some advantages to this profile, okay, and to the Woodcock-Johnson in this area. And that's what I'd like to just talk about for a moment. We often think of discrepancy as a difference between ability and achievement, but we can think about really 3 types of discrepancies. We can think about type 1, or an intra-achievement. That means someone who's got a discrepancy between their reading and their math. Or we're just looking within achievement and we're seeing there's a discrepancy in their performance in different achievement areas. Or we could look at the cognitive battery, a type 2, and we could see a difference in the subject, strengths and weaknesses that are significant kinds of discrepancies in cognitive functioning. Okay. Or we can look at the third type, which is what's the difference between their achievement and their cognitive functioning. Right. Now, it varies from state to state, so you would need to know within your particular state what the regulation was. In Michigan, we need a type 3 discrepancy identified and documented. Some places require a type 2 and 3. In other words, they're making a link that says we need to see an aptitude achievement difference, and we suspect that it's caused by something in the cognitive processing area, a perceptual deficit, for instance. That'd be a common, okay. if anyone who's been around long enough knows what we used to do is use the Wechsler and look for intracognitive deficits. We used to look for subtest scatter on the whisk. And if we saw that kind of variation, we said, well, this is the indication of learning disabilities. And this is what accounts for it. So, you know, the notions are things that change with time, and they change with places, too. Okay, on this test, we could get any of these kinds of discrepancies. So we have all the information. We could look at the achievement and see that. We could look at the cognitive and see by the bands this kind of discrepancy. And then we would look at that achievement aptitude profile and see this difference here. Now, one of the key things of this instrument is that the cognitive and the achievement were normed on the same population. And one of the things about this achievement aptitude profile is that these are what are called normed discrepancies. This is showing what actually happened in the norming population. It's not a predictor. This is a record of what actually happened. So we're saying those are normed discrepancies. And so one of the key problems in determining discrepancies is eliminated if we're using this profile. And that is the regression phenomenon. Okay. And we don't want to go into a course on regression phenomenon, but I think it's just important for you to know that the regression is a phenomenon that occurs whenever we are predicting something, predicting one thing from another. So if you think about, for a moment, someone's Michigan football player, and we think about their athletic ability, okay? And so in terms of football, or athletic skills that were related to football, they'd be excellent, and they'd probably test at the top percentile in football skills. If we gave them an overall athletic test, or a swimming test, or if I asked you, well, what do you think Harbaugh's swimming ability is based on his football playing, you probably wouldn't guess that he's as good a swimmer as he is a football player. You wouldn't have reason to guess he would be equally good. But you might guess that he's better than average swimmer because overall athletically, you might guess, well, he's not going to be as good as he is in that sport, but overall sports, he's going to be closer, he's going to come down a little bit closer to the average person, but probably still be strong. That's the notion of the regression phenomenon, that when we're predicting something from another, we won't predict the same, but we're going to predict that the person is closer to the mean or to the average in the area that we're predicting. Okay? Same is true for someone who just absolutely can't do something and they're at the bottom in some level of skill. Okay, if I get the most handicapped reading person and you ask me to predict math, not knowing anything about them, I'm going to predict they're closer to average in math. They're not going to be as bad in math as they are in reading. Okay, so that's the notion of regression. And what happens if, okay, this is really the heart, I think, of what you need to know about this is, let me put this one up first. I can't put it up first because I already put that one up. Okay. The notion is, the closer you are to average, then the regression phenomenon is not going to be as great. But the further you are from average, either above or below, then the greater that phenomenon will have an impact on the prediction. So what we'll see here, we see represented, this is the average standard score, 100, the 50th percentile. Okay? This is 111, 121, 130. Okay, that's 2 standard deviations above the mean. Okay, and so what we're saying here is if someone has an IQ of 115, we are not going to predict reading achievement of 115. We're going to regress that toward average. That's why you see that line coming this way. If they're, think of our football player, if his football IQ is 130, we're not going to predict a 130 swimming IQ. We're going to move it back toward average, but it's probably still going to be above average, but it's going to move back toward average performance. Okay? The same will happen below average. So if we're below average in one thing at 85, we're going to predict you're not as bad. You're a little bit closer to average in something else. So you'll see the lines coming up, and that's what it means, moving toward the mean or toward the average. All right. Now what this really means is if we don't do that and we start comparing, if we take a 130 standard score on an IQ test and we say I predict then that this student should have a 130 on a reading test and they only get a 125, and I say, well, there's a 5-point difference, I'll be way off because I shouldn't be predicting 130. I should be predicting 121. And if they get 125, they're really 4 points better, not 5 points worse. Okay. So the heart of the matter is when people are starting with the numbers of how many points difference with standard scores and they do not take regression into account, it is very problematic for populations that are away from the extreme. And when we're talking about special ed placement, we're talking about these 85 kids, the 85s, the 80s, 70s IQ kid coming to play a lot. So this is what happens if we don't, just to summarize that. Okay. And this is just showing you, if we use the selection criteria, 15 standard point differences, okay, what percent would be identified? What percent would we find that 15-point difference? If we don't regress, okay, if we do regress, look what happens. If we don't regress, lots of bright kids, the better than average kid is going to place as learning disabled. The lower than average kids are unidentified. Okay. Some authors suggest that failure to take regression into account is probably one of the major problem areas at present in professional practice, and you will be hearing more about it and hopefully we'll be getting more attention to it. Now, in this case, okay, that's a normed discrepancy. You don't have to worry. Regression is taken into account. Yes?
So that basically happens when you're trying to compare one test done on one population with another test done on a different population, trying to make comparisons between the two?
The question is it when you're comparing across test instruments and making comparisons, and not necessarily, because what happens is on the Woodcock-Johnson, if you use the full scale IQ as your predictor instead of the aptitude score, then you have to take into account the regression factor. So it's not a matter of different tests. It's a matter of something they did procedurally different that documented where students with that aptitude score actually fell. Okay? They didn't do that with the broad cognitive and the achievement in the norming population. So if people choose to use their broad cognitive as the predictor, they're going to have the same problem everybody else has.
So the only way that's possible is to use this?
No. The only way, the comment is the only way it's possible is to use this. No. What you need to do is use a chart and a table, and you need to know the reliability of your IQ test, and you need to know the reliability of your achievement test, and you need to know the correlation between those two instruments. And then you get a table and look up what your prediction will be. It will adjust for the regression factor. Okay, and so some people are going to choose that option if they're using a set of instruments pretty regularly. Then they can find out, once they're used pretty regularly, you can find out the reliability of the test, and you can find out the correlation between your Wechsler and different achievement tests. And if it correlates at 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, whatever the correlation is, will alter that. So you can devise a table or chart to correct for you. This takes care of that, so you don't have to do that. But one thing you need to know, though, I think, is that if people use the broad cognitive, they still have to do it, and there are tables available for that. Okay, there's a table that will show what the correlation, I think it's in the blue book. The, no, not the Hessler, I get tangled here. Right, I have a copy here somewhere. Okay.
Oh, this one. Okay.
Oh, no. Right, ASB, you're right, it is in an ASB. ASB 5. And it's also in this book. Okay. Okay. There are other issues involved in whether or not to use the Wechsler or any full scale, or even within the Woodcock-Johnson, to use the full scale rather than the aptitude clusters as your predictors. And so probably the heart of a lot of discussion in the literature at this point in time is in which to use and which is better and why. It's a little bit more than we can go into now, but those are where you'll run into the problem areas. Okay, we really, you've been really super, and we've really whisked through a lot of things this morning, and I'm very confident that you are leaving with information overload.